Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Gayatri, your host, and today we move into episode 5 within our season 3 of Catalyze Your Self. And in this season, we've been walking step by step through what happens inside of us when we are under sustained pressure and how those internal shifts begin long before anything shows up on the external world. We have explored how pressure changes our internal orientation. We've looked at what happens when our inner ground becomes less accessible. We've seen how our pace can move out of sync with our alignment, and we have focused on how presence of mind begins to slip when that internal collaboration is no longer fully available to us in real time. Today, in episode 5, we will focus on what happens when those internal shifts begin to directly influence our discernment or the ability of our mind to operate in a fully integrated way. And what exactly do I mean by this? Because when we speak about discernment, we are not simply speaking about decision making, and we're not simply speaking about thinking. Discernment is an executive cognitive function within our mind where our prefrontal cortex is able to process all signals and information being communicated from our emotions and consciousness through our nervous system. It is our mind's ability to evaluate, to integrate and determine what is most aligned in any given moment. It allows our cognition, emotion, and consciousness and nervous system to work together and collaborate in real time. When discernment is accessible, we are present completely in the current moment and we are integrating what is relevant for all parts of our mind. We are evaluating what is important and true for ourselves, and we are choosing our response from a place of internal harmony. And for this, our mind needs space to process without being rushed, compressed, or operating from a place of perceived threat. And because of this, pressure can result in creating conditions where our mind is not able to discern effectively. We've spent time in our earlier episodes focusing on some of those conditions. We know our ability to pause can become less under consistent pressure. We know our ability to hold multiple perspectives can begin to reduce under pressure. And we know our nervous system can start to orient towards stability and control rather than openness and integration when we are under pressure. And this is where urgency enters the picture also, as the way our mind takes or adopts to create stability and control. And when urgency becomes our primary driver, it begins to replace discernment, because urgency does not evaluate, urgency resolves. Urgency seeks to reduce the discomfort of what is open, uncertain, unresolved. And when urgency takes the lead, executive cognitive function is completely changed. Instead of integrating signals, our mind now prioritizes closure. Instead of evaluating fully, we begin to start moving towards completion. Instead of allowing clarity to form, we begin to act to reduce internal tension, so we can regain the sense of safety that pressure took away. Urgency in the context of what we are exploring is not simply about time, and it is not about the need to act quickly. Urgency is a compensatory pattern that our mind adopts to be our primary driver of response and engagement when we are under pressure. And like any compensatory patterns we have as defaults, we learned it somewhere along the way in our lifetimes. It could have been modeled to us by the environment we were in. It could have been the response that brought in some kind of external validation that we valued, or it could have been the response that gave us the sense of relief, even if it was temporary when faced with pressure in the past. In a nutshell, urgency is a learned adaptive pattern that becomes default under pressure. And the nuance with urgency is that it typically shows up in response to pressure and then it becomes pressure in itself. At its origin, when it started, urgency is an attempt at restoring stability by moving to closure. It is our mind recognizing that something remaining open feels better when it is closed. When something is uncertain, something is unresolved, it feels unstable. And that current state of not knowing, not closing, not resolving to our mind feels like lack of safety. However, once urgency becomes our primary driver of response, it increases the pressure internally for our mind. And it starts to influence how we engage with decisions, how we respond in conversation, and how we tolerate uncertainty, and how long we're able to stay with something that is incomplete. So now our compensatory pattern that we adopted to ease pressure starts to become a self-generated internal pressure to resolve. It is the approach of steel sharpens steel, but misapplied. Increasing internal pressure in an attempt to resolve external pressure. And when it comes to our mind, this internal pressure loop typically does not show up as sharpening of our mind. Typically, what it creates are fractures where parts of our mind dominate, and that could be where we lean primarily into logic or emotion or autopilot or intuition. And all of this creates less space within our mind to work together, and as a result, creates conditions that prevent discernment. Having said that, let me share my own experience with urgency from once upon a time that gave me so much insight as I started my own journey to strengthening my mind and learning to remain steady under pressure. Overarchingly, in this time period, the pressure I encountered did not come from one dramatic crisis. It came through accumulation. Too many decisions that mattered, too many people that needed something from me, too little time between one demand and the next. And from the outside, I was still functioning well. I was responding quickly, staying on top of things, doing what needed to be done. But inside my mind, a completely different story was happening. And without fully realizing it, I had started using urgency as my way of coping. Moving quickly gave me the feeling that I was staying in control. Resolving things fast gave me brief relief. Finishing one thing and jumping to the next made me feel like I was reducing the pressure, even though the pressure itself was not actually easing. What was really happening was that I was no longer responding from presence. I was responding from internal pressure. One of the first things I noticed was that it became harder to stay with anything that was open. If a conversation was unfinished, if a decision needed more time, if I did not yet have all the information, I could feel this internal tension rise in me almost immediately. Open loops no longer felt neutral. They felt destabilizing. Instead of sitting with them long enough for clarity to form, I want them closed. Not because they were all ready to be closed, but because leaving them open created a discomfort I did not have the capacity to hold. And that led to the next shift, which is where resolution quietly became my priority. I was no longer engaging with situations to fully understand them. I was engaging with them to get to the end of them. I would answer before I had fully processed. I would decide before I had fully integrated. I would move conversations forward because completion felt better than complexity. In the pretext of being decisive and efficient, I was choosing relief over alignment. My tolerance for uncertainty was becoming smaller and smaller. Things that normally would have felt manageable, ambiguity, nuance, waiting, not yet knowing, began to feel heavier than they actually were. I found myself wanting immediate answers, immediate clarity, immediate direction. Uncertainty began to feel like It was less and less a normal part of life and more like something I had to eliminate. I was not staying with multiple possibilities. I was pushing for one answer, one outcome, one way to settle my own nervous system. What I recognized at some point of time when I was reflecting to find patterns that I could heal from, learn from, and grow from was that when I was moving through life with urgency, pressure was no longer coming from what was happening around me. I had started generating it from within me. Even in moments when there was no real emergency, I still felt a sense that I should be moving, deciding, handling, closing. I created timelines that was not necessary. I pushed myself towards action when rest or reflection would have been what I needed. My nervous system learned urgency as my default approach to living life. And so even when life gave me space, I did not know how to enter it. I kept producing pressure because pressure had become the way I knew how to function. Once I had reached the point in my life where I decided to live with conscious presence of mind, pulling out of the lessons of this particular experience of this time in my life became invaluable. My reflections showed me how subtly we learn these compensatory patterns and how easily it can become conditioned or a default response to life. At the surface level, these patterns can look like capability. It can look like keeping life together. Underneath it, I had lost something essential. I had lost my ability to remain with myself when life was still unresolved. And once I saw that, I understood that the real issue was not how much I had to do. It was that I replaced my discernment with a coping strategy of urgency. I was no longer asking what is actually aligned here. I was asking what will make this feeling go away the fastest. That was a turning point. I began noticing that the urge to rush was not always a sign that action was needed. Sometimes it was simply a sign that discomfort was present, and they are not the same things. Under sustained pressure, I defaulted to urgency because urgency gave me an illusion of control. The faster I moved, the less I had to feel the discomfort of what was still unresolved. Over time, open things started feeling intolerable. I wanted decisions made and uncertainty eliminated because my nervous system was treating something remaining open in itself as pressure. Resolution became more important than understanding. Relief became more important than alignment. And eventually, the pressure was no longer coming from my circumstances. I was internalizing it. I was creating timelines, forcing conclusions, pushing for action, even when nothing was asking for it. What looked like responsibility on the outside was internally a loss of discernment. I was no longer asking what was true or aligned. I was asking what could make the pressure stop the fastest. Pressure I generated myself internally. What I've shared from my life is not unique to me. I've seen it in so many that have moved through life with me. This is a pattern I've also seen in my coaching clients across different roles, different industries, and different stages of life. And that matters for us to recognize because urgency does not just happen in one type of person. It can happen to anyone. It can happen in high achievers. It can happen in caregivers. It can happen in leaders. It can happen in team members. It can happen to any one of our family members. It can happen in people who look from the outside like they're functioning extremely well. So now let's spend a little time on what operating with urgency actually does over time. Because the consequence is not simply that someone moves too fast or that they prefer resolution as the speed of light. The deeper consequence is that urgency quietly changes the conditions inside of our mind that discernment needs in order to function. Discernment asks for space. It asks for internal collaboration of our mind. It asks for enough steadiness that our cognition can evaluate, our emotions can signal, our conscious awareness can deepen, our subconscious defaults can be recognized, intuitive insights from our unconscious can be observed, and our nervous system can remain settled enough for all of that to happen in order to create alignment. Urgency changes that environment completely. Over time, urgency trains our mind to prioritize relief over alignment. The question inside our mind shifts. Instead of asking what is true here and what is the most aligned here, we start asking what will reduce the pressure the fastest. That is a profound shift because once relief becomes the measure, closure can begin to look more attractive than clarity. Urgency also reduces our tolerance to reopen something that we have tried to close. Questions can feel like pressure. If you've ever found ourselves in places where when questions come our way, challenges come our way, seeking clarity comes our way, and we find that beyond our capacity to deal with, we are probably under pressure and we have created an internal pressure of urgency. Ambiguity feels like a threat. And as that happens, the mind starts moving towards quick answers and premature decisions and surface level resolution. And anything that gets in the way of that feels unsafe. And another factor is when we are operating under urgency and we are resolving things because we want to resolve things, things may appear handled. But if they were not fully integrated, they do not actually settle. They return later, often in the same form or a slightly different one. If we have ever found ourselves encountering the same type of issues again and again, that is the moment to ask if our approach has been coming from discernment or something else. Over time, urgency also weakens our relationship with a pivotal part of our mind ecosystem, our self-reflection. Our mind becomes so oriented towards what is next rather than what is here in the now. Reflection starts feeling inefficient, something we don't have time for, something we're too busy for. Pausing feels irresponsible, silence feels uncomfortable. And because discernment depends on enough internal space for things to be processed and integrated, the loss of reflection becomes the loss of discernment itself. In the end, the posture of urgency not only sustains pressure, instead of alleviating it, it also fragments attention and reduces our mind's depth and our ability to collect wisdom over time. Another consequence is where our self-trust begins to fall apart quietly. We start moving before we are ready. We start concluding before we are clear. We start acting from internal stress and then try to understand ourselves afterward, if at all. And when that pattern repeats enough times, our relationship with our own inner knowing becomes much less steady. We stop fully trusting the pace at which clarity naturally forms. And so the disconnect with discernment is not only cognitive, it is relational, as in our relationship with ourself. We lose the relationship with the part of us that can stay present, open, and internally aligned long enough for wisdom to come through. So reclaiming discernment is in many ways a return to ourself, a return to our steadiness, a return to our capacity to stay present before we act, return to our own inner authority so that life is no longer being led by pressure and once again by our internal alignment. So, how can we reclaim discernment? For that, we need to begin by restoring the internal condition that discernment requires. And the first step is to recognize urgency for what it is. Not every urge to act is clarity. Not every internal push is instruction. Sometimes the urge to move is simply a sign that discomfort is present. And just because discomfort is present does not mean immediate action is what is needed. This is one of the most important distinctions we can learn. And the second step is to slow down enough to re-enter our internal collaborative state. When we feel urgency rise, we need to create, even if it is a small one, a pause before our next step. A moment of reflection, a check-in with ourselves. What am I thinking right now? What am I feeling right now? What is my body signaling right now? What do I know beyond the pressure to be true? That pause begins to restore the collaborative space inside of our mind. And the third step is to rebuild our tolerance for lack of resolution. Discernment does not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it forms through staying with complexity just a little longer, through allowing the situation to remain open long enough for more than one layer of information, truth to become visible. Reclaiming discernment means relearning that not having the answer yet is okay. It is often the part of the process of arriving at what is the best for the moment. The fourth step is to distinguish relief from alignment. Relief is immediate. Relief is a dopamine hit. Alignment is deeper because what we choose reflects who we are and what we value. And that distinction becomes stronger the more we practice it. And finally, reclaiming discernment requires us to respect our nervous system without surrendering leadership to it. Our nervous system may move forward what feels safest and fastest, but conscious presence of mind allows us to guide that response differently. We do not shame urgency. We recognize it, we understand it, and then we choose whether it deserves priority in the moment. And now, as we reach the closing of this episode, let us take a moment to sit with what we have explored today. Today, we focused on what happens when urgency begins to replace discernment. We looked at how urgency is not simply about moving quickly or having a lot to do. It is a compensatory response our mind can adopt under sustained pressure in an effort to restore stability and control. We have walked through how this shows up in our everyday lived experiences and how it can become familiar enough to feel regular, and how over time it begins to reshape our ability to stay with what is open, tolerate uncertainty, and choose from alignment. And most importantly, we looked at what it means to reclaim discernment, not by forcing ourselves to be perfect and not by judging the adaptations we have learned, but by recognizing urgency sooner, slowing down enough to re-enter internal collaboration within our mind, and returning to ourselves before we move forward to the next step. And before we close, I want to leave all of us with a few reflective considerations. Let's ask ourselves, where in our lives are we rushing for closure more quickly than clarity? Where have we mistaken relief for alignment? And when urgency rises inside of us, do we recognize it as a signal of discomfort? Or do we automatically treat it as an instruction to act? And if this conversation resonated with you, please do stay connected with me so we can continue strengthening this work together. And as always, please share your reflections and experiences through the platforms you're listening from, so all of us can continue learning and growing together. And in episode 6, we will move into what often follows next when obligation overrides our alignment. Because once urgency begins replacing discernment, it becomes so much easier for our choices to be shaped by what feels required, expected, or necessary, rather than what is truly aligned with ourselves. Thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Gayatri, and until next time, let us continue strengthening our mind, deepening our awareness, and staying connected to ourselves as we move through life under pressure.